Corey, what is your advice for small towns with small dating pools?
Is that all that small?
Well, life, a big part of it is about setup. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere, I've had a lot of years, over the years, I should say, I've had a lot of clients that are like way out in the boonies. They're very wealthy. A lot of them work from home, and they might have this huge mansion on a lake and a bunch of property, and there might be like 15 people within like 20 miles. And so, it's not like you're going to go down to the end of the block, your favorite watering hole, have a beer, or go down the lake where there's tons of people. It's just, it's kind of remote. So what I've suggested to those guys is that, well, on the weekends you should drive 45 minutes, hour, whatever it is, into town where all the thing action is happening. Get yourself like an apartment, depending on obviously what you can afford. For a guy that's living out there, it's doing well. Get yourself a nice apartment somewhere in town, decorate it real cool. Most of like the coaching clients I have typically are high income, high net worth people, but I deal like with guys that are farmers, and so they're like in the middle of nowhere, and or guys that train horses or rustle cattle or whatever it happens to be, and so they're just regular dudes. But you've got to think of your social life because yeah, you want to work, but and farming is a hard life. But point being is if you're like this guy writes in, he's out of the area. You need to get an apartment somewhere where the action is, so you can go in town and hang out and do fun social activities in the weekends and your time off. And over time you'll meet other people. Maybe it's like say you lived somewhere in Florida and you're like out in the middle of the state somewhere in the boonies where a lot of the farmland happens to be. So the state's 80, 100 miles. You're probably about 45 minutes to an hour to drive to a cool town where there's stuff to do. You get an apartment in there, hang out. You could be on the dating apps. So you go to town for the weekend for your social life, hang out, have fun, hook up in the city. And when you meet girls you really like, then you can have them come out to your house in the country that's 45 minutes, an hour away, and hang out, have fun, and hook up by your lake. And the fact that there's probably more animals within 20 miles than there are people of where you live. And yeah, that's typically what it does. But you're going to have to go, it's just like fishing. My uncle, my aunt and uncle, my Aunt Charlene, who you guys have seen, a few years ago in the podcast. I remember when they first retired, probably like 2010, they moved down to South Florida. My uncle Richie, he found a lot of good areas where there was a great place to fish and catch tuna and good type dolphin, good type of fish you could eat. And he would go out and you catch a bunch of fish. But you go to those same places now 10, 12 years later, and it's like the fish have moved on. They're somewhere different. So that's one of the hard things is like if you're going to fish, you have to go where the fish are. So if you're fishing in an area that 10, 12 years ago, like you throw your line, 2, 3 lines in the water and catch, a handful of tuna, 3, 4 tuna in like a half hour, 45 minutes, it was great. Now you go out there, you might be out there all day and not catch a single fish or get any bites. And so it's just the same thing when it comes to your social life. You got to go where the people are, and you want to go hang out where people have a similar goals, similar values, similar hobbies, similar interests. Cause,
It's called the Great Migration.
yeah, people that like the same things tend to like each other. So go hang out and lose yourself in hobbies and interests of things you love doing for fun. So like I said, per the questioner, if you live out in the middle of nowhere, you either move if you can't move, but you can afford it, or maybe get a part-time job, get an efficiency. Get a nice little kind of like how would somebody go into a community college? Where would they get a one bedroom at somewhere, that's cool. They have some privacy. They maybe, in Airbnb these days, maybe they get or just in the paper, or online, or Craigslist, or Zillow, or Apartments.com. Any of the places where you get apartments, there's going to be places that you can get for pretty cheap. Maybe just rent a room in somebody's house, has its own door, because you need a home base to go to. You need something. You got to figure it out. Because I have younger guys who are like, where do I go? I live with my parents. It's like, get a part-time job, dude. Figure it out. Back in the day when I was young, I was working an internship that didn't pay me anything, and I worked as a bartender. And so I had 2 jobs. I had 2 sources of income when I was 21, 22 years old, and plus I was going to school. So, and I had a nice place, I had a nice car. Here's what's interesting. So it depends on what you do for a living. So my father, who at the time, he was a manager, he ran a store for a company called Linen Supermarket. And I remember I went from working for service merchandise and I was making like, I think I was making $5, $6 an hour or something like that. And this would have been in, what was it, 1991. So I'm making $6 an hour, and I was working close to 40 hours a week. It was like taking home like $200 a week. It's not a lot. I was living at home too on that. And then so I got a job tending bar, and I go from making that to basically making $500 to $700 a week. And this is back in 1991. And so keep in mind, my dad is a store manager for Linen Supermarket, who they've now since gone out of business, but it was kind of like a Bed Bath and Beyond type of thing where they sold linens and stuff like that, and bathroom accessories and kitchen things, and it was Linen Supermarket. It was a big place, kind of like an Office Depot when they used to have big stores. And he's like, well, I told him how much I was making. He's like, you're making more than me. My dad had his own business. So he had a couple coin laundries, and me as a bartender, again, I went from making $6 an hour to making $500-$700 a week, tending bar. And so I was probably working maybe 30 hours, 35 hours a week for that. So, and that was in 1991. And even now, that's 35, 40 grand a year. And then during the season, which would get busier, sometimes you could bring in $800, $1,000 a week. And this is back in 91. You work in a nice restaurant, you can easily make, you got to hustle. But if you're, it's like we talk about AOC. She was a bartender, and the place that she worked at, went out of business. So she's working at a place that's not very busy, but it never dawned on her. She's got her beauty and her body and her charm. She could have easily gone to a really nice steak and seafood place where the average dinner check is, $200, $300, $400, $500, versus some little hole in the wall bar where she's working, where the average tab is cheap. As waiters, you get 20% of whatever the check is. So the smart thing to do is, if you're good at it and you're charming and you have a personality, and she's beautiful, she could have easily gone and worked in an expensive steakhouse and been making 6 figures in New York easily doing that. So it really depends on where you work. If you sell boats for a living, you could sell $100,000 little small ski boats or jet boats or whatever, or you can do, sell $4 or $5 million yachts. You're going to sell fewer yachts, but the commission on 4 or 5 million versus 100 grand or a couple hundred grand is like, that's a big difference. And you're dealing with a different type of clientele. It's the same amount of work, the same process for each type of thing. So you got to think about that in terms. It's like, it has nothing to do with how smart you are or your connections. It's all about, you want to work smarter, not harder, and something like that. If you're going to work in the food and restaurant business, go work where the checks are expensive, the service is high end, and they're busy, versus someplace where, like me at that sports bar that I worked, just because it was close. And this is going back to like 2010, I think it was 2009, 2010. I worked there, at the sports bar. It's well known in Florida, South Florida. And I remember in the summer when it was really slow, I'd walk out there with like $80 a night. So I'm making less 20 years later at this particular bar and restaurant, because I was just waiting tables, even on a full closing shift when it was real slow. And when I worked at Chuck's back in the early 90s, it was typically always at least $100, $150 a night minimum as a bartender. And when you have special events or it's busy, whatever, you're making several hundred a night. There might be 2 bartenders there or whatever. So it depends on where you work and how it's structured and what the size of your checks are. So, and that's in any business, whether you're selling food or you're selling boats or you're selling cars. You want to work smarter, not harder.